He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
How could I? You're always yapping.
There are television moments that make you laugh, moments that make you cringe, and then there are moments so explosively controversial that they follow a show into history like a shadow it can never quite escape. 440 Towers, one of the most beloved and brilliantly crafted sitcoms ever to grace British television. That moment came wrapped in a German accent, a concussion, and one of the most spectacularly ill-judged goose steps ever committed to film. What began as a comedy about a hopelessly incompetent hotel manager somehow managed to ignite a cultural debate that has burned for nearly 5 decades, and shows absolutely no sign of going out. So let us pull back the curtain, walk into the lobby of 40 Towers one more time, and examine the scene that didn't just push boundaries, it walked straight through them, tripped over the welcome mat, and knocked over every lamp on the way down. Before we can understand the controversy, we have to understand the show, and before we can understand the show, we have to go back to Torquay in 1970, a sleepy seaside town in Devon that played unwitting host to the Monty Python team during the filming of Flying Circus. The cast and crew had checked into a modest establishment called the Gleneagles Hotel, expecting nothing more than clean sheets and a decent breakfast. What they got instead was something far more extraordinary, and far more aggravating. The hotel was managed by a man named Donald Sinclair, and to call him eccentric would be to dramatically understate the case. Sinclair operated his hotel with the kind of suspicious, barely contained hostility usually reserved for people who believe they are perpetually under siege. Guests were not welcomed so much as tolerated, and even that tolerance was thin and conditional. He questioned their motives, doubted their intentions, and seemed to regard basic requests, a clean towel, a working telephone, perhaps a meal, as deeply unreasonable impositions on his time and dignity. The stories from that stay became legendary among the Python team. Eric Idle's briefcase, left briefly unattended in the lobby, was hurled over a garden wall by Sinclair, who had apparently concluded it contained a bomb. Terry Gilliam committed the unforgivable offense of using his cutlery incorrectly, prompting Sinclair to storm across the dining room and deliver an impromptu lesson in table manners to a man who had not asked for one. For most people, this kind of experience would simply produce a strongly worded letter to the management. For John Cleese, it produced something far more valuable, a character. Cleese watched Sinclair with the particular, sharp attention of a comedian who recognizes gold when he sees it. Here was a man so catastrophically unsuited to his profession, so magnificently and consistently wrong in every judgment he made, that he had accidentally become a kind of comic performance art. Cleese took notes. Years later, working alongside his then-wife and creative partner Connie Booth, he transformed those notes into Basil Fawlty, a hotel owner of towering ambition, negligible competence, explosive temper, and absolutely zero self-awareness. The character that emerged was both a direct tribute to Sinclair and a sharply observed portrait of a particular strain of British snobbery and social anxiety that audiences recognized instantly, even as they winced at every new catastrophe. 40 Towers premiered on the BBC in September 1975. The critical reception was, to put it generously, mixed. Several reviewers found the show baffling, its humor too frenetic, its characters too extreme. One particularly memorable review declared it a mess, which, ironically, was something of a compliment, since mess was precisely what Cleese and Booth had been aiming for. The audience, however, understood immediately. They recognized Basil's particular brand of suffering, his desperate attempts to appear sophisticated, his towering rages when those attempts collapsed, his awful, beautiful inability to ever leave well enough alone. The show ran for just 12 episodes across 2 series, the first in 1975 and the second in 1979. That 4-year gap between series had a story of its own. By the time the second batch of episodes was written and filmed, Cleese and Booth had divorced. They continued working together with remarkable professionalism, producing what many consider to be the finest episodes of the entire run, but the personal landscape had shifted irrevocably. The show they had created together was also, in a way, the final chapter of their collaboration. Despite, or perhaps because of, its brevity, 40 Towers achieved a status that few television programs ever reach. In 2000, the British Film Institute ranked it the greatest British television series of all time. That is an extraordinary achievement for a show that ran for fewer episodes than most modern series manage in a single season. The secret, most observers agree, lay in the writing, meticulously constructed farce that built pressure with the precision of a Swiss watch before releasing it in spectacular, cascading fashion, and in the performances, which elevated material that was already extraordinary into something approaching art. And then there was The Germans. Broadcast in October 1975 as part of the first series, The Germans has the distinction of being simultaneously one of the most celebrated and most controversial pieces of British television comedy ever made. On paper, the premise is relatively simple. A group of German tourists arrives at Fawlty Towers while Basil is recovering from a head injury, and Basil's desperate, concussion-fueled attempts to avoid making any reference to the Second World War result in him making absolutely nothing but references to the Second World War. In execution, however, the episode becomes something genuinely extraordinary, a sustained, escalating nightmare of social embarrassment that culminates in Basil performing a full goose step through the hotel lobby while doing an impersonation of Adolf Hitler. The scene did not arrive without warning. The episode had been carefully building toward its catastrophic climax through a series of smaller disasters, misunderstandings with the hotel staff, Basil's mounting agitation as the German guests remained cheerfully polite in the face of his increasingly obvious discomfort, and a growing sense that the situation was going to end very badly indeed. When the breakdown finally came, it was both absolutely shocking and absolutely inevitable, which is precisely the mark of great farce. British audiences in 1975 were divided almost immediately. A significant portion found the episode hilarious and entirely defensible. The joke, they argued, was transparently not about the Germans at all. The German tourists in the episode are uniformly decent, patient, and reasonable. They are not the target of the humor. Basil is the target. Basil, with his pathological inability to let anything go, his obsessive need to control every situation, and his catastrophic failure to do so, is the one being mocked. The war jokes are not a celebration of British wartime attitudes, they are a savage satire of them, a portrait of a man so trapped in the past that he cannot function in the present. Others were less convinced. Letters arrived at the BBC in considerable number, many of them angry. Critics accused the show of trivializing a conflict that had cost millions of lives, of reducing genuine historical tragedy to a source of cheap laughs. Some called for the episode to be permanently withdrawn from broadcast. The BBC did not go that far, but the internal debate was reportedly lengthy and heated, a measure of just how deeply the episode had struck a nerve. John Cleese was not, and has never been, a man who responds to criticism by retreating quietly into the background. When the controversy over the Germans broke, he stepped forward and defended the episode with characteristic directness. His argument was consistent and, to many observers, entirely persuasive. The episode was not making fun of Germans or of the suffering caused by the war. It was making fun of the peculiarly British tendency to remain psychologically fixated on the war long after it had ended, and it was specifically making fun of Basil Fawlty, a man whose every attempt at dignity collapses into humiliation. Cleese pointed out what careful viewers could already see, that Basil's German guests never once lose their composure or their good manners. They respond to his increasingly bizarre behavior with patience and confusion rather than offense, which serves to highlight just how absurd Basil's behavior actually is. The episode is not asking the audience to laugh at German people. It is asking them to laugh at a specific type of British person who is so dominated by a historical narrative that he cannot engage with the present reality in front of him. That is a meaningful distinction, and Cleese has made it repeatedly over the years. Whether or not one agrees with that argument, there is something worth noting in the fact that Cleese felt it necessary to make it at all. Comedy that requires explanation has, in some sense, already lost a portion of its audience. The question of whether the Germans communicates its satirical intent clearly enough, whether a casual viewer understands that Basil is the joke and not the Germans, is a legitimate one, and different viewers have answered it differently depending on their own backgrounds, experiences, and relationships to the history involved. Decades after the episode first aired, The Germans found itself at the center of a new and in some ways more intense controversy. The rise of streaming platforms brought classic television to global audiences who encountered the show without the cultural context that British viewers of the 1970s had carried with them. Scenes that had been read one way by one generation were read very differently by another. Several streaming services chose to remove the Germans entirely from their catalogues, while others opted for edited versions that removed specific lines or sequences deemed particularly problematic by contemporary standards. These decisions provoked an immediate and fierce response from fans of the show, who argued that editing classic comedy was a form of cultural vandalism, that removing the difficult moments also removed the satirical point those moments were designed to make. The debate touched on questions that have become increasingly prominent in conversations about art, history, and responsibility. Can comedy made in a different era be judged by the standards of the present? Does context, the satirical intent, the identity of the target, the cultural moment of creation, change the ethical calculus of a joke? Is there a meaningful difference between a joke that uses offensive material to make a point about that very offensiveness and a joke that is simply offensive? These are not questions with easy answers, and the controversy around the Germans has served as one of the most discussed test cases for working through them. John Cleese himself has been vocal in his opposition to what he regards as misguided censorship, arguing that satire has always required the freedom to explore uncomfortable territory. Without that freedom, he contends, comedy loses one of its most important functions, the ability to expose the absurdity of human behavior, including behavior that society might prefer to pretend does not exist. To sanitize the show, in his view, is not to protect audiences but to condescend to them. What often gets lost in discussions of the episode's controversy is the human reality behind the show itself. Fawlty Towers was not made by people sitting comfortably in a writer's room, immune to difficulty. It was made by a small, dedicated cast and crew who poured extraordinary effort into every scene, sometimes at genuine personal cost. Andrew Sachs, who played the endlessly bewildered waiter Manuel, became one of the show's most beloved figures. His portrayal of Manuel, a man perpetually operating at the intersection of language barrier and genuine confusion, was a masterpiece of physical comedy and timing. It was also physically demanding in ways that went beyond normal performance. During one scene, an actual frying pan was used rather than a prop, leaving Sachs with a genuine injury. In another episode involving a kitchen fire, things went further wrong than planned, and Sachs again paid the price in bruises and minor burns. He never complained. He showed up, he performed, and he made Manuel one of the great comic creations of British television. Prunella Scales, who gave Sybil Fawlty her magnificent combination of withering authority and domestic exasperation, brought to the role an intelligence and precision that matched Cleese's at every turn. The dynamic between Basil and Sybil, two people who seemed to exist in a state of permanent, low-grade warfare, worked precisely because both performers were committed to playing their characters as real people rather than comic types. Scales understood that Sybil was not simply a foil for Basil's disasters. She was a person with her own frustrations, her own ambitions, and her own very reasonable assessment of her husband's failing.